Welcome, folks, to episode 13 of the Chi-Town Shoot Wrestling Podcast. I'm Marcin, and I'm coming at you from the heart of the wrestling world, Chicago, Illinois, bringing you the latest news, hottest takes, and all things WWE, AEW, but today it's more of WCW. Don't forget, folks, we want to hear from you. Send us your thoughts, your questions, and your wildest predictions to chitownshootpodcast at gmail.com, and we'll tackle your comments in future Chi-Town Shoot mailbags. Let's jump into it. If you guys remember last week's episode, we started reviewing Who Killed WCW, which is created by Vice TV and the folks over at $5 Productions, or $7. I keep forgetting which one it is, with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Today we'll be reviewing the last two episodes of Who Killed WCW. These two episodes focus on Vince Russo, who many blame to be an important factor in the downfall of WCW. And we're also going to review the last episode, which focuses on the selling of WCW, and as well as some of the backstage politics and scheming that was going around when the discussion of WCW being sold to another company was happening. So we'll delve deep into the rise and fall of wrestling's one of wrestling's most iconic promotions. We'll be currently starting with the final years of WCW, and buckle up, folks, because there's a lot to cover. So previously on Who Killed WCW, we discussed how Eric Bischoff was initially pegged as the man responsible for WCW's downfall. However, we later shifted the blame towards the corporate executives. A lot of the corporate executives didn't like wrestling as part of TNT's and TBS's lineup. They felt like this product was beneath them. And a lot of people, including Eric Bischoff and wrestlers who worked in WCW, blame the corporate executives for WCW's downfall. So in these next two episodes, we're diving a little deeper into the events unfolded after Eric Bischoff's departure in 1999. In 99, Eric Bischoff was fired, and Brad Siegel, who's the Turner executive, who had a lot of responsibilities, and one of them was putting him in charge of WCW. Siegel was not fond of this responsibility, and he quickly handed it off to Bill Bush. Siegel, again, this was like one of the many things that he had to manage, and WCW was on the low end of his radar during these episodes. And I think Eric Bischoff might have also mentioned that in his podcast. He felt like he barely saw, Siegel when it came to these meetings. So after WCW was handed off to Bill Bush, Bush's first major move was to bring in Vince Russo, who was fresh off his stint with the WWF. A lot of people at the time considered Vince Russo to be this golden child, this smart person based off of the rating success of WWF Monday Night Raw. Vince Russo came into WCW with high hopes and big ideas. He had a journalism degree, and he cut his teeth writing for WWF Magazine. For those of you folks who don't remember what a magazine is, a physical object that you flip the pages and read. WWF Magazine and eventually WWE Magazine, I think, was in production until about 2012 or something like that, and then they basically disbanded WWF Magazine. But a lot of Vince Russo's experience in writing was for WWF Magazine in the 90s, and being dissatisfied with the television product, Russo began crafting his own storylines while writing for this magazine. And a lot of the attention of WWF executives were caught while reading WWF magazine, and Russo, along with Ed Ferreira, became a central figure in WWF's creative team. Russo's philosophy was what he termed as crash TV. So the idea was to keep the audience constantly engaged by bombarding them with rapid fire segments and storylines, and basically not leaving much room to breathe. So hard and fast title changes, the current era of WWE with the long-term storytelling and letting things breathe, that wasn't really existent during the Attitude Era and the 90s. And this was partially due to Russo's philosophy of what he called crash TV. This approach was partially responsible for the successful launch of SmackDown in 1999, but it also led to Vince Russo, while working for WWF, feeling overwhelmed, and he basically experienced a nervous breakdown in Vince McMahon's office. And during the interview, he said he basically started crying right in front of Vince. So this is what caused him to leave the WWF and move to WCW for greener pastures, probably more pay. And this is WCW's, big coup, is getting that super genius writer who made WWF as popular as it was and turned it around. So when Russo arrived at WCW, he was welcomed by all the mid-card wrestlers who basically saw him as a potential savior for their careers, and hoping that there would be more of a focus on mid-card wrestlers like Benoit, Dean Malenko, and folks like that, Eddie Guerrero, who basically felt like a lot of the oxygen was taken away from the main card, the main eventers like Hulk Hogan. You had Savage at the time. And yeah, so when Russo arrived at WCW, these wrestlers felt like they were overlooked and underutilized, but not everyone was as enthusiastic. Like Hulk Hogan, who was a major star, was not as fond of Vince Russo. Hogan's distrust was influenced by Bischoff, who basically also had some distrust and issues with Vince Russo. Kevin Nash, who's another top star, issued a warning to Russo, basically saying that, this isn't the same rodeo as WWF. This is not the same environment, and you're going to learn pretty quickly that WCW at the time was not doing great. So he told Russo that he was basically stepping into a volatile situation in WCW. Despite that warning, Russo pressed on, confident that he could turn things around. Russo claimed that under his leadership, WCW ratings improved. A lot of people dispute that claim. During the documentary interview, Vince Russo actually said ratings did improve. They improved slightly, but they did improve. And Eric Bischoff was saying, that wasn't as high, it's something necessarily to be proud of with those slight increases in ratings, because that wasn't the goal. Their goal was to overturn WWF, and I don't know if that's something you want to hang your hat on, especially because it was minimal increases in ratings, not what WCW and the company had necessarily hoped. Brad Siegel pointed out that while there might have been a slight uptick in ratings, it was completely offset by advertisers pulling out due to Russo's controversial content. He was mimicking things that he's done in WWF that in that company allowed for more risque content, whereas WCW, which is a subsidiary and company underneath Turner, and they view their product and channel as more highbrow. So putting in this kind of stuff on their television, advertisers were turned off by it. And that was an issue, earning money, because you need advertisers to make money. And that's a big portion of when you're making television. The advertisers found Russo's style unpalatable, and their departure left a really big blow to WCW's revenue. Booker T and Bret Hart were among those who believed Russo's booking was more about self-aggrandizement than benefiting the talent. Russo's tenure saw bizarre and often criticized storylines. If you guys remember those clips, if you saw the documentary, and even if you have been into wrestling and in history lore, like Dustin Rhodes's Seven character, there was that clip with the figure with a white mask in the window, and you had like this kid looking at him through the window. It was very bizarre. Or Jim Duggan's janitorial gimmick. Who doesn't remember the Judy Bagwell on a pole match, or a forklift match? Sorry. These storylines did little to endear Russo to the wrestlers or the fans. So, his tenure really wasn't doing the company any favors. Russo's paranoia grew, leading him to accuse Kevin Sullivan and J.J. Dillon of undermining him. So, feeling unsupported, Russo eventually walked away, basically wanting to collect his guaranteed contract money instead. And his departure left a bigger power vacuum that just left an already chaotic wrestling company into further chaos. In an attempt to placate the disgruntled mid-card wrestlers, WCW offered Benoit the world championship, but Benoit and several of the other wrestlers requested their release, which was granted. And this is where you saw those three wrestlers, including Benoit and Saturn, and I believe it was Dean Malenko, hopping over to WWF. And that was a big issue at the time, because if the mid-card wrestlers are leaving, then you know that you've got issues, because these guys were reliable, they were great, but they were definitely underutilized, and they felt it. That's why folks like them went up to Vince Russo to ask for more TV time, something more to sink their teeth into, and they just weren't getting it at World Championship Wrestling. So that decision was disastrous. These wrestlers soon appeared on, I think it was SmackDown specifically, or it might have been Raw, but WWF programming, and it weakened WCW's roster even more. So, desperate for some stability, Brad Siegel reached out to Eric Bischoff, asking him to return and basically work alongside Vince Russo. And the already kind of contentious relationship they had before now basically increased the tension, having them work together. And Russo had his own vision of WCW, and Bischoff had his own vision for the company. And there was a power struggle when it came between the two. Russo felt like Bischoff was essentially overseeing him and kind of acting as like the head creative person, and Russo was kind of over here. Siegel dodged questions about who was truly in charge, so that just kind of muddied the waters and made everything a little more contentious. One of the most infamous episodes during this specific period of time was the New Blood versus the Millionaires Club storyline. So this storyline intended to rejuvenate WCW's lowering ratings, and instead it kind of highlighted the issues and the internal disarray in WCW at the time. There was a really funny part during the documentary when Kevin Nash kind of reminisces about that botched bloodbath match. They showed the clip of Kevin Nash saying like, oh, the finger poke of doom, you thought that was bad. Well, just, look at this specific segment where Kevin Nash was in the middle of the ring and the blood that was supposed to fall on top of him basically missed him by a number of inches and feet and basically dropped right next to him. And Nash was basically saying to look at his face and kind of see where his head was at with it. And you can tell during this entire documentary, Kevin Nash was just kind of like not caring about what he wanted to say about WCW and looked kind of checked out, honestly, when it came to that. So very, very emblematic of the chaotic state of WCW at the time. So adding to this chaos, there was a decision to put the WCW championship on David Arquette, who is an actor. And this was supposed to promote the movie Ready to Rumble, which was released in 2000, I believe. So this was part promotion, part ratings ploy for WCW. They felt like if they put the championship on David Arquette, that it was going to increase ratings, cause some controversy. And it did cause controversy, but I think at the time it also left a bad taste in the wrestlers' mouths and also the fans who were on forums posting and complaining about this happening. And it was widely panned. And during the documentary, David Arquette didn't imagine himself ever being WCW champion. And he was initially excited, but he had a conversation with Booker T. And they talk about Booker T and David Arquette talk about this during the documentary. David Arquette was talking about how excited he was winning the championship. And then he asked Booker T, and I'm summarizing here, about has he ever won any titles or championships? And he said no. And Booker T basically said that the energy and mood of Arquette kind of shifted, and David Arquette felt guilty about it. And the storyline then kind of shifted into David Arquette saying he doesn't deserve it and that he was going to drop the title. Even Arquette, said it was a bad idea, stewing on it. Russo, however, defended it as, a great ratings ploy, and he wouldn't change a thing. He said in the documentary, if he had to do it all over again, he would still do the same thing. Now, by 2000, Russo was not only booking the shows, but also making himself an on-screen character. And he felt like he would draw ratings, but for the wrestlers and the audience, it only kind of served to alienate them more so. And there was a certain point where Vince Russo basically decided to book himself as the world champion. And a lot of people thought this was the pinnacle of his self-indulgence. And a big turnoff for folks internally and the audience who's watching. And again, their trajectory of WCW's popularity has not been going up. It's been steadily declining. And adding these different layers, I guess hoping to see what sticks. I'm sure there was a degree of Russo's ego. He also mentioned that in the documentary that he felt like he was better than 80% of the roster and more of an interesting character than 80% of WCW's roster at the time. And yeah, it just doesn't resonate well. And that kind of mindset, I feel like, isn't the right one when it came to that, because there are plenty of talented people in WCW that just weren't used properly. And again, WCW in 2000 was the pinnacle of disillusionment, self-indulgence, like Russo, and just very ad hoc and kind of throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And most of it did not stick at all. Now, we talked about the Pinnacle and involving that storyline. When it came to pay-per-views, Bash at the Beach in 2000 was probably the most infamous pay-per-view for WCW. Hulk Hogan exercised his creative control that he had within his contract to secure a storyline where he would leave with the championship, setting up a future return. But Russo went off script and basically delivered a scathing promo that led to a real life lawsuit and Hogan's departure. This basically ended Russo's influence in WCW. And again, another nail in the coffin that is not helping things within the company right now. So when Russo left, WCW's decline accelerated. Brad Siegel, who I mentioned, wasn't caring too much about the product, basically turned to a booking committee in some bid for stability. But at this point, the damage was irreversible. So financial losses mounted, and the red ink on WCW's books basically grew deeper. In a last-ditch effort to save the company, we get this segment with Brad Siegel exploring the idea of selling WCW. Eric Bischoff, during this portion of the documentary, talked about selling WCW through Fusion Media, and they made an offer to purchase WCW for $67 million. And for those of you who remember how much the WWF got WCW for, this was a considerably better offer and deal. The plan included producing weekly TV from the Hard Rock Cafe in Las Vegas, and then launching a pay-per-view called The Big Bang, which was going to be this reset, this new era in WCW. And everything was all in the books until the merger between AOL and Time Warner, which was complete, and that changed everything. Now, Jamie Kilmer, who took charge of WCW's parent company, he had no interest in wrestling. He quickly moved to cancel WCW's TV programming, basically rendering any sale worthless. On March 23rd, 2001, WWF announced that its purchase of WCW's assets were for a mere $4 million. And when you think about that $64 million initial offer from Fusion TV, that is a chump change and a drop in the bucket when it comes to this. The final episode of Nitro aired on March 26th, featuring a simulcast with WWF Raw. And this is the infamous thing that WWE likes to show when it came to this end of the Monday Night Wars. It was Vince McMahon appearing on the big screen, talking about how the future of WCW was in his hands and him declaring his acquisition of WCW. This basically ended WCW as an independent entity, and this is where we started having that introduction of the Invasion storyline, which involved WCW, ECW, and WWF. And you had the McMahon siblings vying for power, and that obviously wasn't up to people's expectations. And a lot of it was based on contracts that, including people like Hogan and Nash and Hall, who had guaranteed contracts, basically sat through those contracts and got paid sitting home instead of doing work. I mean, I don't know. Can you blame them? Booker T recalls the shock among the wrestlers, although many had seen the writing on the wall, and people I feel like still had some kind of hope that you can kind of trudge through it and then make something better eventually. Kevin Nash chose to watch the final Nitro from his house, and DDP lamented, the sudden job losses for the production crew, which was another great thing for this last episode. If you guys haven't seen it, the introduction of this finale was never before seen footage of the production crew and people being interviewed during this last episode of WCW. Very interesting stuff. And I'm sure, like, for folks who haven't seen this, any footage, or, you know, haven't been in this company for decades, to see something new like this, I'm sure digs up a lot of memories. The sale of WCW's assets, including its big video library, was all part of that $4 million deal. So that was subject of a lot of speculation. There's a specific part of this documentary that talks about the potential for corporate espionage, which basically involves some under the table dealings that aren't necessarily above board or legal, getting some kind of kickback for, you know, selling it to this other executive or this company. And some believe that Siegel sabotaged WCW to facilitate its sale to WWF. And they asked Siegel during this documentary, but he just basically pointed to the, you know, the failure in the ratings, and then just the quality of the product and where it was at the time. And that's why it was sold to WWF. And basically saying that the theory lacks any concrete evidence. Stu Snyder, who had connections with both TBS and WWF at the time, dismissed these conspiracy theories. So Stu Snyder, folks have speculated that perhaps he struck a deal with Siegel at the time to facilitate the sale to the WWF. And again, when it came to WCW and its life and its future, without Ted Turner's advocacy, because Ted Turner at this time, after the merger, basically kind of put him in a figurehead position without any real power or influence. Without Ted Turner, you had no champion within that corporate structure. His marginalization following that AOL merger left WCW very vulnerable. And with WWF, when you look at it from, you know, leadership perspective, Vince McMahon was ruling with an iron fist, and he had the most stability when it came to professional wrestling as a company. And after the acquisition, there were talks about making WCW basically a separate brand. And you kind of saw this with ECW later in 2006 and 2007 when they introduced ECW as a third brand. And for those of you who remember or lived through those specific times and watched it, ECW was initially, they had those one-night stand pay-per-views, which did really well. They created this brand, and there was some popularity and interest, as with anything that's fresh and new. And it basically died down into this C brand. And that's how a lot of people perceived ECW at the time. So perhaps, you know, WCW as a third brand may have not been a great idea anyway. When it came to ECW, the stuff that Paul Heyman wanted to do just didn't align with Vince's vision. And at the end of the day, when we talked about Vince McMahon and his iron fist, nothing really gets through his filter. So perhaps it's for the best when it came to WCW. Key contracts, like I mentioned, weren't included in the sale, and many top stars didn't want to join the WWF. That included Hall, Nash, and Hogan. Booker T accepted a buyout and joined the WWF, and he became a big, significant figure in that Invasion storyline. Folks did, like I said, kind of felt it watered down because they didn't have those top guys like Goldberg and Hogan, Sting. I mean, wouldn't that be wild to see Bret Hart back in WWF? That would have been crazy. So during the Invasion storyline, we had these three competing brands, which were all under the WWF brand at the time. It was criticized for its booking, and Nash, who basically returned in 2002 for the NWO at angle with Vince McMahon trying to inject a dose of poison into the WWF, notes that there was a lot of limitations when it came to former WCW main eventers and current WWF established stars. And I mean, if you're working for the WWF, there was going to be no way that someone like a Nash or a Hall was going to lose to like a Rock or Stone Cold Steve Austin or Triple H or folks like that. They didn't have that many opportunities to. And I felt like that was an issue because then there's no sense of, danger, urgency. If everyone already knows that that's not going to happen, then, what's the point? You gotta have some sort of some risk when it comes to, and some sense of like anything could happen, So they all returned in 2002. Bischoff returned to TV under the WWF umbrella in 2002 as an on-air character. And Bischoff, during the documentary, talks about him enjoying this particular portion of his career when he was the general manager. Despite the contentious end of WCW, Bischoff found a new role within the wrestling industry, and he did really well. And I think a lot of people enjoyed his role as general manager of Raw. And we got him talking about how, when Stephanie McMahon was telling him that they were basically going in another direction, it has nothing to do with Eric Bischoff as a person or what he did with work, but they basically felt like it was time for a change. Bischoff agreed to leave the company and end his career with that scene involving the garbage truck, John Cena and Vince McMahon. And he mentioned in the documentary that if I'm going to leave, I'd like for this to happen, because initially they suggested John Cena to throw Eric Bischoff into that dumpster. And Eric Bischoff said, if this is going to happen, the thing that makes the most sense is for Vince McMahon to do it and throw him in the dumpster. And he did. And that was a very iconic scene in WWE at the time. And I think that's one of the highlights of Raw from the past 30 plus years. Now, as we kind of conclude this episode and this entire series, we kind of revisit the central question, who killed WCW? And at the end of this episode, you have a lot of folks who talk about, who killed WCW. You had Brett talk about folks like Eric Bischoff and Vince Russo, who didn't know what they were doing. You've had folks mention people like wrestlers like Hulk Hogan, who contributed to the demise of WCW. I think there was a constant factor when it came to the demise, and that involved the corporate politics, the financial missteps, those executive decisions when it came to actually killing it and pulling the plug instead of giving it life and selling it and giving it to a different company. A lot of folks felt like it was part of that executive branch that made these decisions that ultimately led to the demise of WCW. But, the Vince Russo stuff, the backstage politics, those guaranteed contracts, I think they all kind of lended themselves to that demise of WCW. And yeah, let me know what you guys think when it came to WCW and who killed WCW. This was a really good series. I feel like a lot of it was stuff that we've already kind of known. I think the most interesting parts of the series involved that kind of business side, the allegations of corporate espionage, the perception of WCW as a brand for Turner, those kind of like Succession style stuff. When it came to the business side, I think that was the most interesting part. All the other things were things we've heard before, but perhaps some of the commentary from the WCW talent and Eric Bischoff, there were some nuggets of new information, but on the whole, I thought a lot of it was a retread of WCW, but it was a good documentary. It was well produced. The way that they did this last episode with the ending of WCW and kind of starting with like the unseen footage of the production crew and folks not sure about what's happening and that kind of stuff. Very well done. And I'm honestly a sucker for this kind of stuff. I think it's really interesting when it comes to, wrestling lore and stories. That's kind of my favorite part, is reading the backstage stuff and the logic behind the decisions that are made that come to, decisions like WCW going out of business. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. That's a wrap for this episode of the Chi-Town Shoot podcast. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, rate us, leave your feedback. Tune in next time for more wrestling madness. Until then, keep marking out.